Hi, my name is Jake, and I am a bookish drummer. So for this video, I will be talking about my favorite books that I've read so far in the year 2022. And I'm not going to do like a top 10 list or a top, 22 list. This is more going to be like a comprehensive, like these are overall the best books that I've read this year, and I'm going to break it down into different genres. Like these are my favorite fantasies, these are my favorite horror, these are my favorite rereads, stuff like that. And I've got a lot of books to talk about here, so enough of the preamble. Let's go ahead and jump right into it. So this year has been very different for me reading-wise. I've done a lot of rereading, which normally, like, if you would have asked me like a couple years ago, like I would have said, like, I don't have time to reread. I've got so much friggin' books to read. Why am I going to reread? But this year I've been trying to like catch up on series or just books that I just want to reread because I'm in the mood for it. And then I'm also doing a lot of Stephen King rereads, of course. So for this first part, I'm just going to talk about some of my favorite rereads of the year. And I've got my stack of books here. And I've actually got 3 books here. You guys might be able to guess what it is, but I recently reread my all-time favorite trilogy, which is, of course, The Themis Files by Sylvain Neville. Of course, Sleeping Giants, one of my all-time favorite books. Waking Gods, very good sequel, and Only Human, also a very good sequel. I mean, of course, they're all 5 stars. It's my favorite trilogy of all time, so I had a blast listening to the audios for all of these. And yeah, probably one of my favorite rereads of the year. Another book that I just recently reread with Joanna, and she really loved this book too, is Red Seas Under Red Skies by Scott Lynch, which is the second Gentleman Bastards book, and it's the sequel to Lies of Locke Lamora, one of my all-time favorite books. And this one I love pretty much just as much. Like, they're both 5-star books. And this one, as you can see from the cover, has a lot of nautical stuff in it. And it's very funny, very entertaining. I loved it. Definitely one of my favorite rereads of the year so far. And then, of course, me being a Stephen King-based channel, I've been doing a lot of Stephen King rereads. And I've reread a lot of my favorite Stephen King books this year. Like Roadwork, Carrie, a lot of Dark Tower novels. But probably my favorite was Doomakey, which is one of my all-time favorite Stephen King books, and I haven't read this book in a very long time, and I'm so glad that I did. It was my Patreon winner, and I have a dedicated review for it for anyone who's interested who hasn't watched it yet. And yeah, I just had a blast reading this book. One of my all-time favorite King books, and I'm so glad that I got to reread it. Definitely one of my favorite rereads of 2022. And for my favorite middle grade book of the year, which this is really the only winner it could be because I really don't read a lot of middle grade, and that would be The Boy Who Failed Show and Tell by Jordan Sonnenblick, which is, of course, the author of one of my all-time favorite books, Drums, Girls, and Dangerous Pie. This book came out earlier this year, and I'm actually very excited to read the sequel, or listen to the sequel, I should say. And yeah, this book was just so much fun, very charming. It's actually loosely based on the author's middle grade experience. And yeah, it was, actually, I think this is elementary school. Either way, I had a blast reading this book. And of course, it's very short. I got through it in a day. And yeah, my favorite middle grade easily. And my favorite, I don't know, comedy or humor-based book, I really don't read a lot of those either. So this, again, was a no-brainer. That would go to Hyperbole and a Half by Ali Brosh. And I heard many great things from Stacy and Sharon, who both loved this book. And I basically read this in a day also. It's very hilarious. It's just this woman named Ali Brosh, kind of like summarizing her life, but in like really shitty cartoons. And it's hilarious, and I had a blast reading it. Very funny, and I'm definitely glad that I read it. And I made a point at the beginning of the year to try to read more nonfiction, specifically music-related nonfiction. That didn't really pan out. I've been like 99% reading fiction. But I did pick up this book, which is nonfiction, which easily my favorite nonfiction of the year. And that would go to Bob Odenkirk's comedy drama. And you might recognize that man from being on shows like Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad for his portrayal of Saul Goodman. And actually, before he got that role, as the title suggests, comedy, he did a lot of comedy in his early adult life and, up to the point where he played Saul Goodman. And yeah, it was very fun, very entertaining book. The audio was tremendous, of course, narrated by Bob Odenkirk. And I just had a lot of fun with it. So this easily wins my favorite nonfiction book of the year. And now on to two of my favorite thrillers that I've read this year, both recommended to me by Stacy. These books were very good and for slightly different reasons. The first one will be The Escape Room, which this one, by Megan Golden, this one started off kind of slow for me, but the further on you get into the book, you kind of realize the direction it's going in. And for me, the reason why it's one of my favorites is because of the ending. The ending was absolutely amazing. One of my favorite thriller endings of all time. And for that, it gets 4.5 stars. By far, one of the best endings I've read to a thriller ever. Definitely one of the best thrillers I've read this year. And then the other favorite thriller that I read this year was The Passengers by John Mars. This one kind of was a little bit of the opposite for me from The Escape Room. This one started out with a bang and then just was relentless from the start all the way up until the very end. And then the ending, I didn't love the ending. It felt very convoluted for me, like, oh, this happens, and then this happens. So it felt a little bit convoluted, but the whole book up until that point was just relentless and pulse pounding. Just a lot of thrills, a lot of stakes. I really enjoyed it, and for that reason, definitely one of the best thrillers I've read this year. And now on to fantasy, which I really haven't read that much new fantasy this year to me. A lot of them have either been rereads or I read them and they're not like all-time favorites. But for these two, I would definitely call them all-time favorites. And yeah, the first one I'll talk about is one that I read recently, which would be Foundryside by Robert Jackson Bennett, the first book in the Founders trilogy. I really loved this. I loved the main character of Sanchia. I loved the magic system. I loved the inanimate object, like being able to talk to it. There's so much about this book I loved. I loved the setting. I loved the world building. I loved the humor. The humor was great. I can't wait to read the sequel, Shorefall, in August. So yeah, definitely one of the best fantasy books I've read this year. Also, another fantasy book that I loved that I read towards the beginning of the year, that would be Blackstone Heart by Michael R. Fletcher. This book just felt like a fresh breath of air, and it was really good, very dark, and written in a very unique way. I loved the first person and getting the whole story through the main character's eyes. A lot of really cool twists and turns throughout this book. I loved it. I gave it 4.5 stars. I also read the sequel, She Dreams in Blood, which I liked slightly less. I gave it 4 stars. It kind of felt more of the same, even though I enjoyed it. Up until the very end, it didn't really feel like he was doing anything like spectacularly new. But then you get to the ending and you're like, what the fuck is happening? And then I still need to read the third book. I'm still waiting for the audiobook because I really like the narrations of the first 2 books. I want to wait for the audiobook. So please hurry up with that, Michael. But yeah, I really want to read the third book. It's definitely going to go down as one of my favorite trilogies. Hopefully I didn't jinx that right there. I read the third book and it's trash. But no, I've heard great things about the third book. But yeah, Blackstone Heart, definitely one of the best fantasy books I've read so far this year. And now some of my favorite horror books that I've read this year. This first one, it's kind of a really cool blend of thriller and horror. Some people might call it a thriller, but I think it has elements of both. And that would be Confessions by Kanae Minato. Hopefully I'm saying that name right. I never know if I am. But yeah, great book and probably one of the best opening chapters of a book I've ever read. You get to the end of this first chapter and you're just like, what the hell? Like, did that just happen? Like, literally your jaw drops. You're like, did she just fucking do that? Oh man. And then the rest of the book was just as good, and just reveal after reveal after reveal. This book was amazing. Definitely, and it's also very well paced, very short. Definitely a book that I could see myself rereading. And yeah, I had a fantastic time with this book. And then another fantastic horror book that I recently just finished would be Ungodly by Braden Reddick. This was kindly gifted to me by Sharon, and she loved this book, and I love this book too. This is easily one of the best horror debuts I've ever read. This author already knows what he's doing. He's very on point with his writing. He has a very unique ability to not only create a fast moving plot, but to also interweave in character development very quickly. He writes a couple sentences in a character's perspective, and you get a full grasp on who this character is and what their motivation is and just who they are as people. And it's wonderful. And just and the other thing is, I was reading this book, and you get halfway through it and you're still not quite sure what the hell is going on, but it's still entertaining. And then you get to the end, you realize what's going on, and it's just bonkers. Oh man, I love a good bonkers horror book, and this was definitely one of them. And I want to read more by this author, but it's the only book he has out, and I want to read more. One of the best horror standalones of all time, in my opinion. So yeah, Ungodly, definitely one of the best books I've read so far this year. And now we get to the last category, sci-fi, which I don't normally read a lot of sci-fi, because normally I have a harder time really loving sci-fi. But I found a couple authors that I'll mention here, of course, that just always knock it out of the park for me. And that would be, one of them would be Sylvain Deville. And this is his newest book, Until the Last of Me, which of course is the sequel to A History of What Comes Next. This book I liked slightly less than the first book, but I still loved it. It had a lot of really just jaw-dropping moments, really cool scenes, and of course the character work is always good with Sylvain Deville. That's why I love his books, because a lot of the times with sci-fi, the author kind of mainly focuses on the sci-fi elements and less on character development. But he just has an excellent blend of both for me. The pacing's really good, the characters are great, the story's good, the premises are good. I just love everything about his writing. The only complaint I had with this book is that sometimes it's a little too fast. Somehow this book is shorter than the first book, and just some of the scenes go by a little too quickly, but they were still really good. And this book also ends in a way where I have no idea what the hell is going to happen in book 3, and that's why I love him, because his books are just so unfriggin' predictable. So yeah, Until the Last of Me, definitely one of the best books I've read so far. And I have one more book to show y'all, and not only is it my favorite sci-fi fiction, and I have one more book to show y'all, and not only is it my favorite sci-fi book of the year, it's also just my favorite book of the year so far. It's definitely going to go down as an all-time classic, and just one of my favorite books that I've ever read. And of course, I'm talking about Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. When I first heard the premise of Project Hail Mary, I figured I would go into it knowing that I was going to like it, but I didn't quite know how much I was going to love it. I predicted it was going to be a 4-star book. It was going to be solid, but it wasn't going to be anything to just blow my mind. Little did I know, that's exactly what it did. And when I started reading it, it slowly grew and grew on me. And then by the end, I was just like, oh my God, this book is amazing. And I do have a dedicated review for it if you want to go check that out. And yeah, easily 5 stars, and just one of my favorite books, not only that I've read this year, but just one of my favorite books that I've ever read. So yeah, not a very unpopular opinion there. People just love this book, and I can definitely see why. Yeah, Project Hail Mary, easily the best book that I've read so far in 2022. All right, so those are all the books that I would consider the best books that I've read in the year 2022. Please let me know if you guys have read any of these books and what you thought about them, whether you love them, whether you hate them, whether you thought they were kind of meh, just a little dash of meh. Meh. Stop it. Also, let me know what are your favorite books that you've read in 2022 so far. I'd love to have a discussion with you all down in the comments below. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my YouTube channel and the Book Astronomer Discord. And if you'd like to further support me, go check out my Patreon page and see what that's all about. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching and have a terrific day.